back, everyone. We'll be excited to have everyone having joined us this afternoon as we go through and continue the new Ellis Island Border Policy Summit. Our next panel will discuss the border enforcement accountability and transparency. And to moderate this panel, we have Steve Taylor, who is the editor and co-founder of the Rio Grande International News Service, based in the Rio Grande Valley. So thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today and for your expertise in sharing on this panel. Let's begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. It's great to be here. It's a great honor for myself and the Rio Grande Guardian to be part of this this whole discussion. Fantastic title, 2021 New Ellis Island Virtual Border Summit. The subject matter for this discussion over the next hour is accountability and transparency in border enforcement. We're going to hopefully stick to those topics. And I have four panelists with me now for this discussion. We have Fernando Garcia, Executive Director for the Border Network for Human Rights in El Paso, Texas. We have Shaw Drake, Staff Attorney and Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Texas, also based in El Paso. We have Laura Peña, Racial and Economic Justice Legal Director for the Texas Civil Rights Project in Brownsville, Texas. And we have Adam Isaacson, Director of Defense Oversight in the Washington Office of Latin America. Adam, shortly you can correct that title. So welcome to the four of you. It's great to see you virtually and to be listening to your thoughts. First of all, we're just going to give all four of you a chance to introduce yourselves, and then we'll go over to the Q&A section. So Fernando, how about starting with you?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you again to everybody joining this, I would say, unprecedented dialogue about the border. This is Voices from the Border talking to the nation. And this is a very important and a primary issue for border communities. As you know, Border Network for Human Rights been working at the border for the last 22 years. And let me put in context what we see in terms of enforcement and why we need accountability, responsibility, and oversight. We had experienced in the last 20 years, 25 years, multiple discussions on immigration reform. You might remember 2005, 2006, 2008, then 2013, 2014, 17. So we had multiple moments of discussion of immigration reform. And two things have happened as a result of those discussions. The first one is that there is no immigration reform. There is no pathway to citizenship for 11 million people. There is no new legal worker programs. There is no family reunification. But what we have had out of every discussion in Congress is more border enforcement, more border walls, more border patrol, more money thrown to the border, the deployment of the National Guard, even the deployment of active duty Marines in that sense. And it is important to highlight that then we have today one of the most militarized zones, areas, borders in the world. More than 22,000 Border Patrol agents along the U.S.-Mexico border. That is the largest agency, federal agency in the nation. At the miles of fencing, almost 1,000 miles of fencing and walls. We have technology, the sensors, the visions, the night vision, the drones. And we have a Border Patrol that is acting with a mentality that there is a war out there. So, and we're spending almost $18 billion, if not more, in border enforcement. So this is the problem. I mean, not only problematic because of the amount of enforcement that we have been accumulating at the border, but the lack of effective accountability and oversight mechanisms. Nobody knows if that money or how that money is being spent. Nobody knows what is the impact of this massive presence of law enforcement in our communities, in our streets, in our neighborhoods, on the quality of life, on the human rights and the civil rights of border residents. Nobody knows at this point yet what are the impacts of technology and border fences in the ecosystems, but also in communities. And nobody knows what is the impact of enforcement on economic development, because nobody is doing an assessment. There is no clear accountability mechanisms. Everybody says that Congress is the one that provides accountability, but Congress is not doing it at this point, and it has not doing it for many, many years. So in that sense, I want to be very specific. I mean, Border Network has been working with partners and peers, but also elected officials to create a new legislation, the Border Accountability and Community Engagement legislation. A piece of the legislation that would bring accountability and oversight in very concrete ways to this massive enforcement. This year, this legislation was introduced by Congresswoman Escobar. We're very proud about her leadership on this. The legislation the name of the legislation is the Homeland Security Improvement Act, HR 3557. It was introduced in previous years. Last Congress, it passed the House. It got stuck in the Senate, as you know, but it's being reintroduced again. And what this legislation does, and I'm just going to outline it very briefly, is indeed create mechanisms for border stakeholders to participate in the assessment on the impacts of this enforcement in our communities, in our region. It first creates a commission, what is effectively a human rights commission, an accountability commission that would be integrated for border stakeholders from the northern and southern border, that would assess all of these impacts and recommend Congress the necessary changes. So I think that commission is the way that border residents will be able to have a say on these enforcement strategies. Secondly, it would create the office of the Ombudsman. I mean, that is an internal DHS CBP office where it would review training of officers and agents at the border, the complaint process, the supervision, what are the conditions in the detention centers, in the holding cells of Border Patrol. It will also mandate more training and continued education on human rights and civil rights and vulnerable population for Border Patrol and for other agencies. It would actually increase resources for ports of entry and bring more accountability to ports of entry. It will also have a number of reporting requirements, including the grave human rights crisis of migrants dying at the border, which is something that we're seeing that there's an increase, sadly, of many immigrants dying at the border this year. So this is an example of how we can accomplish the goal. I mean, we know that at this point, we've been asking Congress to accept more enforcement, that we will not accept more enforcement as a trade-off for the new round of immigration discussions. But very importantly, it's not enough just to say no more. We need to say we need to change the way that enforcement is being applied at the border. So I will leave it there, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Fernando, for setting the agenda so well with those opening remarks. I'm sure we'll want to talk about some of those points in depth shortly. But let's move on now for some introductory remarks from Shaw Drake from ACLU, Texas. Shaw, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thanks for having us today. My name is Shaw Drake. I'm a staff attorney and policy counsel working on border and immigrants' rights based on the border in El Paso, Texas, and work really exclusively on all issues related to Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol. I'll just briefly go through kind of our broad-ranging recommendations around accountability and Border Patrol and discuss some ways in which we've engaged on this issue in the past few years, and then really look forward to the discussion and questions. I would just start by saying, you know, Border Patrol is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States, and it is by far the least accountable. It lags far behind any other law enforcement agency in terms of transparent policies and policies that meet, you know, progressive and new standards for policing. But given Border Patrol's very, very long and deep history of abuses, of abusing people in their custody, of abusing border communities, the long-term goal, in our view, around how to hold the agency accountable is removing them from spaces altogether. So first, the two main examples of that are one, Border Patrol should not be in the business of detaining asylum seekers or any migrants arriving to the border. There should be a system of welcoming and processing that many other countries, have models for around the world, to process asylum seekers, provide them appropriate due process that is not in a law enforcement only and enforcement only context. It's unnecessary. It's extremely costly, and it results in inhumane conditions and inhumane treatment that we've seen, by Border Patrol over the past decades. So removing Border Patrol from the business of detaining anyone is first, and then removing Border Patrol from U.S. communities. If Border Patrol's mission is one of supposed border security or monitoring the United States' international border, there is no reason for Border Patrol to be 100 miles within the United States to establish checkpoints throughout that zone that leads to systemic racial profiling and abuse of border communities, or to be within U.S. communities along the border that also results in Fourth Amendment violations, such as racial profiling and harassment and abuse of local communities. And so limiting Border Patrol's scope to what is its core supposed mission, and removing it from spaces that it's proven unable to, in which it's proven unable to conduct itself without participating in mass human rights violations. In the more short term, we've engaged robustly in documenting abuses by Border Patrol and filing complaints with the existing oversight and accountability mechanisms with the Office of Inspector General, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility. Those complaints have largely gone unanswered. We actually filed 13 robust complaints on a range of issues over the past 2.5 years, documenting things like systemic mistreatment of pregnant people in Border Patrol custody, verbal abuse of people in their custody, failure to provide their vehicle pursuit policy and the resulting deadly chases that have come out of Border Patrol's actions in that area. And those cases include, those complaints include hundreds and hundreds of cases of documented abuse by the agency, none of which has been even responded to our knowledge, investigated, and certainly have not been followed through on to the extent that would signal a commitment from the agency for true robust accountability for documented and systemic abuses. And so we sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas just a few months ago, re-upping those 13 complaints and expecting that this administration will deal with those complaints and our future complaints in a much more direct way, hoping that the administration will engage in actual investigations and also examine the system that exists, the failures of that system that have led to organizations like ourselves and many individuals filing complaints and never having an appropriate resolution, to address those issues in a real systemic way, so that there can be some accountability expected, within existing structures as we all work towards the longer term goal of limiting, the scope of the agency writ large. And we also at the ACLU have been supportive of efforts to engage and further have liaison between the agency and local communities. It is vitally important that the agency hears directly from those impacted, and not just from policy wonks as they are from organizations like our own. And so part of our work is also trying to ensure that we can assist in documenting abuses that otherwise would not come to the agency's attention for fear of retribution. Oftentimes we file complaints anonymously on behalf of individuals to protect them from retribution by the agencies as they continue their immigration process. And so we continue to support those efforts, many of which Fernando outlined in detail of establishing mechanisms for the agency to hear directly from the people negatively impacted by the policies and the actions of their officers. Thank you.
Thank you, sure. Okay, let's move on to Laura Peña from the Texas Civil Rights Project. Welcome, Laura. Your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with very respected colleagues, activists, thinkers. I'm a border native. I'm coming to you from Brownsville, Texas. It's in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm going to take a step back from the focus on Border Patrol. And the topic of today's talk is accountability and transparency in border enforcement. And I was thinking about enforcement, right? And who are the enforcers right now on the border? The enforcers are, state actors, as we've been talking about. State actors on the US side, state actors on the Mexican side. We also have non-state actors. Maybe Adam will talk a little bit about the non-state actors, whether it be corporate interests, whether it be criminal network, transnational criminal networks. They are the enforcers. What are they enforcing, right? They are sucking up the space, preventing the fair, humane movement of people, goods, culture, connection. This is all, when I think of the enforcers, it is a broad range of actors who are responsible for allowing the militarization of our border community. How are these enforcers expanding right now? Right now. Just this week, the state of Texas apprehended 10 individuals in Valverde County, Del Rio, and put them in state jail, state custody for the crime of criminal trespass. Right now, there are 10 people who sought protection in the United States, and the state of Texas has arrested, incarcerated, will be prosecuting them for criminal trespass. Huge overreach. Hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be put up in the state of Texas by the governor, by the state, to further enforce, to be bigger, badder enforcers than the ones we already got. Hugely problematic. Transparency. I just have to share what I was dealing with this morning. And if you're not familiar with the Rio Grande Valley, there's two of the lower counties, Cameron County, Hidalgo County, my sister county in the north, the sister city, the major one on the Mexican side, Reynosa, Tamaulipas. We have been working, TCRP has been working extremely closely with Pastor Hector at Senda de Vida. This is what I'm talking about, enforcement and transparency. Our government, let's take a minute, our government, through the International Boundary Water Commission, sent a letter to officials in Tamaulipas saying, we're concerned about the flood zone. We're concerned with this construction of a shelter that's been here for over a decade, serving the most vulnerable migrants and asylum seekers. U.S. government says this border commission, it's an international set by treaty commission, need to take care of this flood zone issue. Enforcers in Tamaulipas, which are primarily gangs, criminal networks, decide this shelter's gotten too much power. Too much power. 600 migrants are currently in this shelter. Tamaulipas, the city of Reynosa, is scheduled to demolish this shelter on Sunday. Transparency. Utilizing an international mechanism that the United States government participates to leverage, to empower criminal networks from destroying a bedrock of human rights, a beacon of protection and safety in the incredibly dangerous Reynosa. That is happening right now. You want to know more? You can go on Twitter, hashtag Senda de Vida. We are calling on the US government to stop all expulsions, especially to Reynosa this weekend, when this entire shelter may be completely bulldozed and people at risk. This is what we talk about. This is what we need, enforcers, right? Who falls victim to them? Who have to like brave and be the survivors? And it's the people who are seeking protection, the most vulnerable, but also the border residents who have been here. We seek openness. We want to be with our families. We want to celebrate together. We want to have the communities that we've been able to have in the past, which are safe, which are joyful, and which are cross-border. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for your passionate open remarks there that has elevated this conversation very much. I appreciate it. Final open remarks here for this panel. Adam, welcome, and let's hear from you.
Thank you. And yeah, I joined Laura and we have been adding our voice, but adding my voice to the denunciation of what the mayor's office in Reynosa is trying to do to Brother Hector and Senda de Vida. It is an absolute outrage. But all right, let's talk about accountability. I work for a foreign policy organization, ultimately. WOLA works all over Latin America, and my job there is to try to stop or limit and monitor and keep an eye on U.S. assistance to militaries all over Latin America. We have a difficult history there. A lot of these militaries have bad human rights records. A lot of times it's very hard in those countries to punish abuses or bring justice for the victims. The United States, in our view, shouldn't be arming forces that abuse human rights with impunity. We shouldn't be making them more lethal. And we've had some success in stopping some of this aid. But for the last 10 years, I've also worked on border security. And boy, are there some similarities here. The idea of an armed security force whose members can commit human rights abuses with a high expectation of impunity, with a culture that tends to protect abusers within the ranks, with a culture that takes an adversarial approach to the population that it interacts with every day, that's often kind of aggrieved and politicized. A security force like that, I think I just described, CBP and Border Patrol in much of its day-to-day operations. I'd be, a security force like that in my other part of my job, I'd be trying to cut US aid to a security force that had those kind of characteristics. Now, okay, one thing, mechanisms like those in the Homeland Security Improvement Act are essential. They're super important, but I think there's still more. I mean, we have to get at changing the toxic culture that's almost in the DNA of these organizations at this point. And I think it requires more than just adding new layers of oversight from outside, as important as that is. I'm still wrestling with how to do that, but I want to put across 3 points in these opening remarks about the culture of these agencies, Border Patrol, ICE, CBP, which I hope we can unpack a bit maybe later. Let's call them everyday abuse, the internal enemy, and management failures. Everyday abuse. I mean, 10 years ago, we were looking at big dramatic use of force incidents, the killings of Anastasio Hernandez or Jose Antonio Eleno Rodriguez in Nogales. They're not as frequent. They're still a huge problem, but not as frequent as they were 10 years ago, these big killings. But what concerns me even more right now are the things that happen every day as sort of deeply ingrained parts of the agency's culture. Things that people like Shaw and the Border Network and Kino Border Initiative are documenting all the time. You know, this constant assault and rough handling of non-violent, already subdued migrants, sexual harassment, gender-based harassment, abusive racist language with those who are in detention, denial of food and medical care and bathroom facilities, even to children. You know, the cases like that woman who was forced to give birth in her pants in a Border Patrol station in California last year. People who fall off the Trump's wall and break their legs and are forced to hobble into places like Puerto Palomas across from Columbus, New Mexico, where there's no services and go get medical attention there. You know, theft of people's belongings and IDs, lying to families who are being expelled, saying they're not being sent back into Mexico when they are. This is a bad culture. Okay, second point, viewing populations as adversaries or enemies. I also work a lot in Colombia, where there's a wave of outrage in that country right now about police brutality. They had these mass protests and a huge crackdown in response to it. At least 45, maybe 75 people killed, many missing because of the way the police behaved, like Portland on steroids. And this police force receives $150 million a year from the United States. Why did the police behave this way? It's what they were set up for. Colombia fought a war for 50 years. That war mostly ended with the peace accord 5 years ago, but the police are still set up to view dissenters as enemies of the state who must be confronted. Something similar happened at the US-Mexico border. You know, and our agents are trained to face dangerous bad guys at the border, right? Cartels or single adults trying to avoid apprehension. Fast forward to like 2019, and 2/3 of the migrant population has shifted. It's now parents and children, people who want to be detained, who are here for protection, to seek asylum, which is perfectly legal here in the United States. But that's not what Border Patrol agents signed up for. It's not what they learned about in the academy. It's certainly not the kind of mission they get praise or promotions or bonuses for doing well. The mentality of the migrant as an adversary is so deeply ingrained right now. Even as the profile of migrants has shifted dramatically, we're going to need more than just better complaint mechanisms to undo that mentality. And finally, just management. I don't want to just blame the rank and file for what's going on here. You know, the Homeland Security Act of 2003 was passed, it created CBP with no internal affairs capacity at all. It was an afterthought. And then, you know, as they were sort of kind of building that up, during the Bush administration, Border Patrol doubled in size. They went on a hiring spree, managers with just a few years experience being in charge. And that sort of fostered this anything goes cowboy mentality, this self-description of the agency as a paramilitary force, which they are not. But within all of that, Border Patrol agents, they're people who live in your communities. They're parents. You see them at soccer practice. You see them at the supermarket. They're people who are going to behave according to the climate that is set by their immediate management. So I don't want to place all the blame on the agent in the field. And even though it's absolutely necessary, I just don't think having more internal affairs people it's crucial, but it's not going to be a magic bullet either. I think reforms have to focus on the management, who these people are. What attitudes they are tolerating, what attitudes they're fostering. It happens at the sector level, but even at the station level, at the shift level. If there's more internal affairs capacity, it should focus on what the managers are doing. How do they respond when something inappropriate happens? When there's a Facebook group, for instance, that's sharing the most outrageous statements. Do they even know what they should be responding to? Or, as I fear is the case right now, do they just circle the wagons around even the worst behaving agents and just try to protect them along with their union? I obviously don't have all the answers here on this toxic culture question, but these are the directions I hope that we can do more work on and that we can look into while we have at least a slim window in the next couple of years open for some reform. And I look forward to hearing from all of you on this.
Thank you, Adam. We're going to take the Q&A questions shortly for our Q&A session. And there are some questions coming in, so thank you for those in the audience that are texting the questions in. We welcome more of them. But before I go there, I'd just like to pick up on something Fernando said when he talked about how these stereotypical views of the border region hurt economic development. They hurt inward investment into our border communities. And the example I always like to cite is, it was a few years ago now, but here in the Rio Grande Valley, the place that the politicians always come down to if they want to be portrayed in their local communities further north as being tough on border security is the Anzalduas Park by the Rio Grande. And on this particular day, it was probably a live show by Sean Hannity on Fox News, on the Fox station, and all these elected officials, probably our governor at the time, Governor Perry, was on that show, and they're all wearing their flak jackets on the river, and the portrayal was how this was such a dangerous place to live. And on the very same day, the McAllen Economic Development Corporation had visitors from China or the Far East coming into town looking to see how they could make investments. And when those visitors got back to their hotels and turned the TV on, they saw all these images of a dangerous location, and they put it to Keith Patridge from McAllen EDC. I did not know about this. Is this true? Is this so dangerous here that we shouldn't be here? Fernando, I'm sure you would have heard similar instances like that in El Paso. As someone that's been working at the grassroots level all these years, how do border communities fight that the optics there? How do we fight the communication that our region is so misreported, underreported? Have you any answers to that?
Yes. Well, I think we've been kind of very active describing how the political dynamic, the political conversation nationally is distorting the reality of the border. I think we need to start there, because with a false and distorted narrative, you will have a distorted strategy, ill-conceived policy, right? I mean, I would say that the current enforcement policies at the border don't reflect the reality of the border. I mean, they are being made as a part of political decisions rather than safety and security decisions. I mean, these policies that we have, this militarization that we have, they don't have anything to do with the idea of having a more secure border. I mean, when you have Border Patrol agents going out there thinking that there's a war out there, the question is, who is the enemy in that war? I mean, why you are so afraid? I mean, is the drug dealer? No. It is the terrorist? No, because I mean, those two elements being used constantly has to promote the border enforcement strategy. But what we had done, though, is as a response to the culture of abuse, is to promote a culture of rights. I mean, we need to start talking about the border being a full part of the nation. They cannot treat border residents in the region at the border as a separate part of the nation that where constitutional rights would not apply, right? So it is really extraordinary how, in the case of Border Network, we are using the Constitution of the United States to actually promote change for border practices. I mean, to actually make Border Patrol accountable to the Constitution of the United States. It is terrible when you see two children playing in El Paso, U.S. children playing on the street in El Paso, and they see a Border Patrol vehicle and they run away. I mean, U.S. children running away from this culture of abuse. So I do believe that this conference, the new Ellis Island, the Hugs Not Walls, the push for accountability and oversight, they have to go with community organizing and community education. I think at the end of the day, Border has dedicated a lot of resources to build that community capacity to respond to all of these issues.
Thank you. I'd like to direct the next question to Laura. Laura, you mentioned these 10 migrants that were apprehended in Valverde County, and that obviously was a state issue. We have Governor Abbott saying that he wants to build a state border wall, but the legislature has not funded, given into his request and funded him in any way. He said he'll take money from a different state agency to start it and then pay them back later. I think I'm correct in saying, well, I know I'm correct in saying that a migrant that crosses the federal border wall would not be arrested for criminal trespass, yet on a state border wall he would. So our thought was, well, can we have them color coded? So the migrants know, which wall they can cross and which they cannot. I mean, tell us more about what's happening at the state level, and many people saying that the governor is doing this just to raise his profile nationally for a potential run for president, etc. What do you think is going to happen at the state level? Are we going to have yet more of a state presence, increasing our militarization from actors at the state level?
Thanks so much. And let's see, where do I begin with all of that? I think maybe just a point of clarification. There is an effort by the state to build border wall. However, the application of the criminal penal code of the crime of criminal trespass and also criminal mischief has nothing to do with the wall itself. So it's just about being on property in the United States that you're not legally allowed to be on, right? And it is pretext for immigration enforcement. So how much more militarization are we going to see? Well, how much are we already seeing? Okay. I just heard a report from a Del Rio resident that from Del Rio to San Antonio, which is just like a couple hours, right? A couple hour drive, On the way there, saw 12 DPS troopers. 12. Okay. In Del Rio, on their fairgrounds, they've put up 8 tents to house staff. This is to house DPS. They are housing troopers in tents to further militarize the community and to arrest, detain immigrants on these state charges. It's complete pretext for immigration enforcement. And when it comes down to it, it's just about jailing more Black and brown, primarily men, right? And who suffers? Who suffers because of this? It's the individuals themselves. It's their families. How is the state doing this? You talk a little bit about the money. They're going to find the money. They've already found the money. There is one state law that expanded the human smuggling statute that already passed and was signed into law. That'll go into effect in September. All right, that's also going to greatly expand the ability of the state to prosecute individuals who are crossing in groups. Greatly expanded this crime. There's 2 proposed laws in the special session. You know, there's a lot of legislators in DC right now getting COVID to help protect democracy. So these bills for now are stalled. But those bills really give the state more ability to put direct funding into counties that have declared this border-related disaster declaration. And so underpinning all of this is a really manipulative, expanded gubernatorial authority to leverage the disaster declaration, which we just saw during the pandemic, right, to keep people safe, turning it on its head and, you know, feeding this narrative that the border is a disaster, is a danger zone, and therefore declaring several counties a border-related disaster. Counties that aren't even on the border. Midland, nada que ver, nothing to do on the border. And they're this age-old trope that they're getting drugs, there's crime and there's drugs. Most of the drugs come through official ports of entry. All right, so what we're seeing is extremely troubling. What can people do? I want to bring it back to what Fernando said just a little bit ago. It's about community organizing. It's about being informed. It's about making sure you stay engaged and watch these issues. So if you are on this call and you're listening and you're upset, you want to be engaged, make sure you're involved. We will be organizing with Border Voices leading, but working with state organizations in Houston, in Austin, really leveraging everybody in the state from border and within the metropolitan areas to fight against what Abbott is doing here.
Thank you, Laura. And we should just say there that in the most populated counties along the border, the county judges have resisted Governor Abbott's efforts they've said no to this disaster declaration, and therefore they're not going to cooperate. Starr County here in the Rio Grande Valley, County Judge Eloy Vera, this is sort of well known down here of how there are DPS vehicles every quarter of a mile with nothing to do, but we've been flooded with them, and they sit on US Highway 83. And he tells us how residents are just afraid to go out. Legal residents, citizens of the United States, afraid to go out for fear of being picked up for very small violations. So I know the 4 counties in the Valley, Webb County, El Paso County, they've all said no, they don't want to participate in this program from Abbott. Okay, so the questions are coming in, which is good. This is a question for sure. Do you have any hope that Ed Gonzalez will bring positive reform to ICE? Sure.
Thanks. I mean, I would start by saying I defer to my other colleagues on the panel that may work in greater detail on issues related to ICE. I think generally, we were disappointed by many of the comments that Sheriff Gonzalez made during his confirmation hearings in terms of, his support for policies like 287G policies, which are collaborations between local law enforcement and ICE officials. Comments related to detainers of ICE detaining people after being being held for criminal charges, by other authorities and a range of other issues. And so certainly we're not encouraged by the initial positions that he took that seemed to be very much kowtowing to Republicans in Congress and their concerns around quote unquote security issues, or wanting to see him take a tough stance on immigration policy from ICE's perspective. So it remains to be seen. I think like has been mentioned by other panelists, leadership is extremely important to some extent, but it is also extremely limited in other ways. Even if someone like Sheriff Gonzalez came in and tried to change a culture at ICE, that is something that will take years and years to do, and requires more than just a politically appointed head of the agency taking new positions. It requires change in culture all the way down through rank and file to individual facilities. Is wrapped up in issues like contracting with private prison companies and things like that. The same thing will be true, when or if a new CBP commissioner is confirmed, even if that person may come from a different background than other commissioners and may have some more progressive positions in their background. It does not mean that person will be able to change the entire culture of the agency that has been deeply instilled all the way down the line. So I think a lot of that remains to be seen, and certainly unfortunately no magic silver bullet or anything like that will fix all of these problems coming from the top.
Thank you, Shaw. I'm being told by the team that there's probably only 10 minutes left of our discussion, which is unfortunate because we're just getting started. That's a shame. But let's bring Adam back into the discussion. A question from someone in the audience: how can the Biden administration be trusted to do the right thing when they're still using quote unquote country of laws, quote unquote prosperity, quote unquote border security rhetoric? To this viewer, those translate to militarization and capitalist protection. Adam.
Well, you shouldn't just blindly trust the Biden administration to reform the way we go about border governance. The Biden administration is somewhat scared. I mean, they have, as has been said, they have razor-thin majorities in Congress. They are worried very much about losing the majorities in Congress in the midterms next year. And within the administration, there are some people they've brought in from the reform community to be officials in key areas, but there's also a lot of very old school people who grew up in this culture and are veterans of the way we've always done border security within the Biden administration, even if they're not as radical as the folks who held power in the Trump administration. So, they are trying to strike a balance and not sound too scary to purple state moderates so they don't lose ground. And that's why Ed Gonzalez, under the current circumstances, might have had a hard time being confirmed if he didn't, and he may still though, if he didn't adopt some of this rhetoric in his hearing. But the irony of this, of course, is that this squishy approach is not working. Look at the polls that give Biden about a 33% approval rating on how he's handling the border and migration right now. And that's not just because he's not hardline enough, although some of it, of course, is. The culture change issue is long-term, as Shaw just said. It may not even be all that popular right now because American people haven't really been educated about it. So right now, while we have a better configuration of power in Washington, we have to focus on laying the foundations as while the full hard line is not in power. And how do we do that? Certainly not just by trusting them. It's by putting pressure on them all the time. Through organizing, as Laura was saying. I think of the border counties, which are some of the purplest that are going to need some real solid organizing, but also through public opinion, just constant storytelling. I'm always struck by how American public opinion became suddenly very sympathetic toward the migrant population during the family separation crisis in 2018 with these photos and audio recordings. People started caring. Then we weren't able to reproduce that, even though we were causing just as much pain for people with MPP and Title 42, but it's been harder to get people to care about that. Even when families are separating right now, sending kids across the border unaccompanied. Why? We need to figure this out, to be honest. And we need to be doing more storytelling and monitoring of this everyday abuse that I was talking about that's resulting from the toxic culture.
Thank you. Well said, Adam. Couple of quick questions then. This one directed to either Shaw or Laura. Can we sue the Border Patrol or ICE, etc., in US courts? Either of you?
There's lots of that. So, Shaw, why don't you start?
I think the short answer is yes, you certainly can sue them in US courts. And we do sue them for many things. There are certainly challenges and limitations to bringing lawsuits against individual agents. You know, we at the ACLU represent the family of Claudia Patricia, who was shot in the head by a Border Patrol agent and killed. And it is very legally challenging to bring cases to hold agents accountable for those type of abuses. There's a long string of worsening case law coming out of the Supreme Court and elsewhere, limiting the ability to hold government agents accountable for their actions. And so there are challenges. There is also obviously challenges to bringing cases in places like Texas, where we have seen, the courts being used as a tool for a conservative agenda to challenge the Biden administration's policies and to bring cases like the recent decision against DACA before judges who are conservative leaning. And so given the border, much of the border is in Texas and in those jurisdictions, that is another challenge. But I think the overarching takeaway should be that we are not going to find salvation for these issues in the courtroom. That has to happen through organizing, culture change, education of the public, so that the border can't be used as such a convenient fear-mongering tool by nefarious politicians. And given all the limitations and the current makeup of the Supreme Court, at the end of the day, victories in the courts are going to be limited and few and far between and challenging to receive, and so we can't bank on that as our primary tool for affecting change on these issues.
I want to try to get all these questions in. So the next one's for Fernando. Have the conditions at Fort Bliss improved recently after all the media attention?
Listen, what we want and what we demand is the closure of that shelter in Fort Bliss, Chapter 4 unaccompanied minors. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, yes, there's been a lot of complaints. There's been a lot of reports about the bad conditions in that center. But let's step back and again think about how can we explain having children in a military base. I mean, what part of that narrative doesn't fit or should fit or not with what we call American values? So I think for us, this administration should be more prompt to actually build welcoming centers, welcoming infrastructure, rather than continue placing these children in military bases or in jails or cages. So I think our approach is that, no, I mean, we don't want to improve the conditions in a military base for children. We don't want that installation, that shelter in that base to exist at all. I think it should be other way to do this, where children can reunify faster with their families.
And earlier in the discussion, we had the proposition was made that the Biden administration should remove Border Patrol from detaining. Do we have any, as a panel as a whole, do we have any recommendations as to who would do that, take that responsibility away from Border Patrol, which federal agency should come in and look after that aspect as the migrants seek asylum?
And I think that was the point that I might, so maybe I can take first pass at it. I think that the alternatives are, one, limiting the interaction with Border Patrol to only the most the limited collection of basic information and documenting of the apprehension or the interaction with the agency, and then people being moved on to some model of a welcoming center that perhaps could be run by an agency like HHS, but most importantly is not a facility that where the people there are under the custody of CBP or ICE. The other key element of that is that such a facility would have access and hopefully very open and robust access for social workers, child welfare professionals, and legal services, so that people can immediately connect with legal services to advise them on their case. And there's been a lot of thinking, I think, across coalition organizations that put forward a very detailed plan of what those kind of welcome centers could look like. But at the end of the day, the most important elements is that they are not centers that are controlled by ICE or CBP, as those are agencies that have proven completely unable to humanely care for individuals. And if a government agency is overseeing it, such as an HHS or others, that the facility is widely open to other outside organizations, independent experts, so that there is never kind of the black hole of facilities like we currently see in CBP, where people are held in inhumane conditions and no one outside the agency is able to have eyes on what's going on.
I'm not sure the context for this question, but it's being asked, how can we assure that the border will not be a trade-off in any package being considered in Congress? You're nodding your head there, Fernando. What do you think?
Well, that's precisely what it took us to where we are right now. I mean, we have a massive militarization process at the border because of these political trade-offs in Washington. I mean, it seems easy to be in a negotiation table in Washington and then listening what you can give up or not. And this is very dramatic and very unfortunate that the Democrats actually had accepted those trade-offs. I mean, every time there was a promise for some kind of legalization, some kind of citizenship, the usually Republicans would put that this enforcement first agenda. Say, well, yes, but if you build more walls, yes, if you do this, and this is not only about Republicans. I wanted to recognize that Democrats also accepted that trade-off. So I think communities at the border, but also communities in the nation, they know very well the damage done already. So I think I think we need to pressure the Democrats to hold their ground and say, we will not accept more militarization of the border. We need to, instead of that, we need to create accountability and oversight and responsible mechanisms at the border. I think that should be the collective narrative to push both the Democrats and Republicans at the end of the day.
Laura, do you want to add something there?
I would add, there are groups of individuals who have been impacted by the DACA decision, who are traveling from Texas to Washington, D.C. I'm sure, Fernando, you've made your trips to DC, but I would just, again, reinforce the power of community, reinforce the power of organizing, making sure that the border voices are heard in Washington, DC as these decisions are being made.
Great. I think we're being allowed to go to the full hour, which is fantastic. So let's have a few closing remarks. Adam, what would you like to say?
Sure, maybe I would just expand on that last point too. In 2013, when the Senate controlled, the Democratic Party controlled the Senate, and they were debating the big comprehensive immigration reform package, the way that they devised to get enough Republicans to get past the filibuster to go on it was to add an amendment doubling the size of Border Patrol. To 40,000 it would have been. There would have been border patrol everywhere. And people at the border complained, but they were ultimately ignored. Even Bernie Sanders voted for that amendment. I mean, because it was this big compromise that was going to bring it forward. The border gets thrown under the bus when this sort of thing happens. And I sort of wish Congresswoman Escobar were here to participate in the conversation about how to keep it from being thrown under the bus again. One great way to do it, but it's not a short-term fix, is to, as some people in the Biden administration say, make the border boring. Let's constantly attack the idea that the border is under crisis. The fact that there are people coming here seeking asylum and then being duly processed and put into alternatives to detention should be boring. Should be people just filling out forms and then nothing really happening at the border. And we're not there yet. But if the border is boring, there'll be a lot less pressure to do these horrible trade-offs anytime we get any reform on immigration policy.
Sure. What do you think?
I don't know where to go with closing remarks. I mean, I think building on Adam's points, which I certainly agree with, you know, I think the most important element is education, is constantly combating this misunderstanding of a border reality. I mean, when I receive friends and family here in El Paso, I constantly point out, you know, where we are, how close we are to the border, and how, you know, the picture that they see around them is not the one that is portrayed on the news. I think it is extremely easy to imagine a line in the sand and an invasion, you know, happening to a country that's scary, when you have no context for what the border really is. And what the border really is a vibrant, you know, transnational community, with amazing culture and amazing people doing an amazing work. And it's not anything like the kind of crisis and emergency or fear-mongering narrative that is so capitalized on across the rest of the country among people who have you know, no context for what this place is or you know, what makes it up. So I would just say, you know, that will be of constant importance to getting to a place where we can see real and meaningful reforms to hold the agencies accountable for their actions. That I think will only come when we have you know, championed that narrative and have changed the general perspective on how we should be talking about the border and what the most important issues, you know, are here.
Thank you. Laura, final thoughts.
Thank you. I guess I'll stay with the same thread, and I would just, you know, take us one step maybe deeper, not only just the national, what the border means in the national consciousness, and push back against that. And I'd have to think about the border as boring. I see where you're headed with that. I'm not sure as a border, or David, if boring is the right word, maybe beautiful, complacent, tranquil. Those are good descriptors. But I would go one step further, and even within the border, for those who are listening who are from the border, or who live in the border region, you know, I would also challenge us to look at ourselves, because the fissures that we're allowing this national narrative, this negative rhetoric to divide us is really problematic. The amount of money that's being put into the border region is causing us to be complacent, because my primo works for Border Patrol, because, you know, my sister is, you know, works in the shop where, you know, or works in the office where, you know, at the immigration court. You know, it is deeply rooted in our economy, and that creates a challenge for us to be able to find it within ourselves to still push back, to demand better opportunities, different opportunities, so our people can advance, and not throw stones at the folks who are just recently arrived. This can't be a border residents versus recent arrivals issue either here on our region. So while I agree with happening in DC and this national negative narrative 100%, but we also got to look at each other. So thank you very much.
And Fernando, your final thoughts.
Yes, I do believe that the discussion that we're having about what the border is and what the border ought to be, it is not only reflective of the border itself, it's a reflection of the nation. What this nation will be in 50 years and 100 years from now. I do also believe that it's not only about immigration. I mean, immigration is one aspect of that discussion, but it has to do about education, democracy, voting rights. I mean, we're trying to define what America will be. You know, it will be a place where you build walls or cages for children, right? It will be a place where you accept that diversity is beautiful, and the multicolored society is what we aspire to. That we that we're aiming for, accepting that immigrants built this country in the past, continue to build it now, and will be an essential part in the future. So I think we're in the middle of that larger discussion that is not being defined. And it's only going to be defined by those actors, by communities, by society. Unfortunately, that's the way it's going to go. And it is not defined yet. It can go either way. But I'll go back to the premise that we need to organize and we need to participate. We need to develop leadership in our communities, not only at the border, but in the interior and in different other communities of color. Because what we are fighting is not just one shelter in a military base where they have children. What we're fighting are systems, militarization, racism, criminalization, white supremacy. I think we're fighting those, but also we're putting forward our vision, the new Ellis Island, the vision of democracy, the vision that immigrants of color will define also the character of the nation.
Yes, great remarks.
Very beautiful, Fernando. That was beautiful.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much. What a great panel. Very absorbing, insightful discussion here. Thank you all, Fernando, Shaw, Laura, and Adam. Thank you very much for being on this panel. And I'm going to hand it over to the next panel, I think.